BBC lay down and did its master's bidding during COVID. It gave its airwaves over entirely to the government propaganda of the moment, and I think Johnson's government was very pleased with the results of that, because the BBC put its whole heft behind the idea of lockdown and all those ridiculous restrictions on our personal liberty which the government introduced. And remember, it didn't allow any dissent whatsoever onto its airwaves. Now, that to me was proof positive that the BBC is the state broadcaster, when, as I say, in extremis, it does exactly what the BBC, and no government is going to happily forego that very important role that the BBC plays, because they never know when they might need it.
That's an excellent point, and it brings me on to a question I wanted to ask you about our new government, the Andy Burnham government, which we didn't vote for, but there it is. Well, I guess 25,000 people in Makerfield kind of voted for it, or at least voted for him. What do you think that the BBC's role will be with this government? I mean, I watched Newsnight last night and it was just mortifying. I mean, their tongues were out of their mouths. They were so excited about Burnham. They were just gushing in a way. And, they didn't have to say he's going to be a brilliant prime minister. Everyone should support him. You can just hear it in the tone of voice, the way in which they present the ideas, the way in which they challenged the Tory MP who was on the couch, who was treated as just a naysayer and a cynic and so on. The whole thing was infused with this kind of Burnham mania. Now that might not last, of course, but where do you think that kind of ingrained BBC progressive bias, where do you think that might go in the Burnham years or months, depending how long it lasts?
Well, as you say, the BBC, I'm sure the majority of people in the BBC are thrilled by the idea of Burnham. After all, remember, this needs restating over and over. The point is that the BBC, its core values are aligned with progressive opinion in this country. So the BBC is always going to be sympathetic, at the very least, to a Labour administration and to anyone who defines themselves as on the progressive side of politics. So the Starmer government was, of course, a huge disappointment to them because of its rank incompetence. But it's worth remembering that one of the previously most powerful journalists in the BBC, Andrew Marr, spoke in such glowing terms about the incoming Starmer government. This was, the adults were back in the room. How I hate that trite little phrase. As if, of course, to be adult, you've got to sign up to the progressive agenda because anything else is infantile. I mean, obviously, it's so insulting, really, and it's Marr absolutely typified that core BBC mindset. And now what will happen is that the BBC will, I am sure, give Burnham and Co. A following wind over the next few months. Now, I have to say, in defence of the BBC, that I think its core Westminster political coverage is by and large pretty good. I think that if you boil it down to what appears in the news bulletins coming out of the Westminster newsroom, by and large, that is a pretty good, straight political news service. The difficulty comes in all the ancillary programs, because there is far more scope for people to play fast and loose with impartiality, so-called. I mean, I still meet people, and I'm genuinely surprised I still meet people who think the BBC is in some way impartial, that it is in some way above the political fray. I don't want to be rude about these people that I've met, but I think that is a a surprisingly credulous mindset that anybody who still believes that must be blinded inside the political bubble they inhabit, because the BBC clearly is not in any sense impartial. I mean, the latest example of this was the radio series produced or presented by Alex Forsyth. It was about 10 years after Brexit, and Newswatch UK, which is an organisation which is sceptical of the BBC and has been for many years, analysed that series of programmes. It's a 10-parter on Radio 4. Out of the entire range of interviewees in those programmes, only one came from a pro-Brexit position. The series was, in effect, a cry to the heavens, my God, isn't Brexit awful? It's been a disaster. You know, that's what it was. And, you know, the fatuity of that is this, that we were in the, you know, look, we were in the EU for 40 odd years, and we've had 10 years being out of it now, and we're not yet found our feet as after having exited the EU. I think that's fair to say. But to judge Brexit now at this point and say it's all been a ghastly failure and we ought to get back in as quickly as we can is actually just political propaganda. There is no evidence for that, actually, and there are plenty of things on the plus side to Brexit. But you will not hear that from the BBC. And actually that programme, 10 years on from Brexit, is just, it epitomises all that is wrong with the BBC. I mean, the fact they didn't see that themselves, that the thing was so unbalanced, is kind of extraordinary and tells you a lot about the internal workings of the BBC.
That's such an apt point that, for me, often it's the fact that the BBC can't see the problems, or it lives in denial of them, that is the most shocking thing, because you just know that they're in such a bubble that everything makes sense to them, regardless of whether it all makes sense to other people. You mentioned the Prescott dossier from last year, and of course another part of that was in relation to the BBC's discussion of Trump, and we've seen the controversy in relation to its editing of a Trump speech to make it look like he was calling on people to attack the Capitol building. I wanted to get your sense of where you think things lie with the BBC and Trump now. I mean, whenever I have to be careful that I don't allow my own skepticism of the BBC to cloud my judgment, but whenever I watch the BBC, there's a tone in relation to Trump. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit. You know, this notion he's a problem, he's bad, the people who voted for him are probably a bit stupid. I mean, it does drip through in the coverage. Do you think that will be ongoing, or do you think the pushback that we've seen over the past year, such as it is, might actually make the BBC think again about how it covers those things?
No, I don't think the BBC will ever give Trump a fair crack of the whip. I don't see, this might sound like an unfair thing to say, but it is the truth that the BBC's North American editor, Sarah Smith, is the daughter of the late John Smith, who was the leader of the Labour Party. Now, I'm sure that Sarah Smith is a fair-minded woman. I'm sure she strives to be impartial. I'm afraid as a consumer of her output, I think she has failed in that. I think that her tone of disparagement, her tone of her clearly sceptical tone whenever she talks about Trump, betokens her underlying view of the man, which is that he is an excrescence, an aberration, someone who should never have been allowed near the White House. And as with so many BBC people, they find it inexplicable that someone of Trump's nature and politics should have risen to the position that he has. There are the one person I know in the BBC who manages to break that mold actually is Justin Webb, who is a man who actually has maintained his critical faculties and actually has a very good understanding of why Trump became president. But I think harking back to what we were talking about a moment or two ago about progressives, I think it is still a mystery to the progressive mind as to why someone like Trump has succeeded, or why Farage is as popular as he is, because in the progressive mind, this is inconceivable. Why do these people, with their crass views and their outspokenness about issues which all polite people maintain a discreet silence about, like immigration, why do these people prosper? They prosper, of course, because they articulate the concerns of people who the progressives do not cater for in any sense or shape. And the BBC, I don't know this because I'm no longer inside the BBC's. I don't know, but I would imagine that the BBC is very nervous at the moment about its American coverage. And rightly so. I've no idea what will happen when the court case eventually comes to trial, whether, as the BBC hopes, it'll be thrown out because of the submissions that its lawyers make about the fact that the distortion of the Trump speech couldn't have done him any harm because it wasn't broadcast in America, etc., etc., etc. That defense. By the way, that defense seems so threadbare, really. We're not arguing here about, the fact is the BBC did this thing. It allowed this thing to happen. It did something which in any fair-minded journalistic outfit would be considered a mortal sin. This way of editing somebody. It's positively Soviet in its propagandizing in those terms. But the BBC, I'm sure, will have told its North America correspondents to tread carefully around Trump. But even so, I think that the underlying dislike, even hatred of the man, comes through.
Yeah, it really does. I think
it really does.
And it's very much tone, as you say, there's that tone thing.
Exactly.
Robin, I just have one more question for you before I let you go, which is just, you mentioned earlier that governments probably look at the BBC as a very useful tool because there are moments when it will do the bidding of the state. It will do as it's told. You gave the example of lockdown. I guess that raises the question, what might really push the BBC question to the forefront of public life in terms of whether it stays as a public broadcaster or whether it becomes a subscription service, whether it's more voluntaristic, whether there's a household tax? What is the thing that might propel that to the forefront of public discussion if there is this probably niggling reluctance amongst the establishment to force that question because they know they can fall back on the BBC at certain times? What do you think might make that discussion really take off?
It's clear from the trend line on the number of people taking or now paying for their TV licenses. The BBC is hemorrhaging license fee money. So this is near the point at which it becomes existential for the BBC, I think. So now I contributed last year, actually no, it was earlier this year, to a book, a series of essays about what's going to happen to the BBC and how we should pay for it. there was one very interesting suggestion in that from, there are people out there, sadly I'm one of them, I suppose, who are immersed, who are marinated in this, in BBC affairs. And the suggestion was this, that, because there is a problem for the government, and for Lisa Nandy in imposing a household tax. I mean, the point is, Brendan, that I think that few things would arouse the ire of a large percentage of the population more than the imposition of a so-called household tax to pay for a television service they don't want. I mean, that would be, and, you know, at a time when taxes are already arguably too high already, you know, to put another tax imposition on people, on behalf of the BBC, actually, I don't think would go down terribly well. So there is this suggestion, a suggestion I saw floated, which was that, the government might define a BBC core service. So picking up on the point that I originally made and you've just picked up on, the fact that governments do find the idea of a state broadcaster inherently attractive for obvious reasons. Suppose the government was to say, right, well, we can see the problem here, you know, and we're not going to force everyone to pay for a service they don't want. So how about this? How about if we were to find, let's say, £1 billion a year out of general taxation to fund what we will define as the BBC's core service. So maybe, let's say, BBC One, Radio 4. I mean, you can add on things, you know, there would be a discussion about this. We don't need to go into the detail of that. But if you like, a slimmed down BBC service available to all, without paying any extra license fee at all. But on top of that, you have a subscription service. Now, going back to the point I make about the craft skills within the BBC and its expertise at making popular programs. And let's be honest, you know, the BBC has produced programs which all of us have enjoyed. I have enjoyed BBC programs. I'm sure you have too, Brendan, because it's not all rubbish. You know, some of it's very good indeed. So suppose you did have this hybrid system where you had something paid for out of general taxation to provide a core BBC service, the news service, whatever you want to call it, which would be a handmaid of the government, should it be necessary next time, and it will be necessary. There will come a moment when the government will need to commandeer the BBC and get it to do its bidding, and the BBC will do that. So that's the point to remember, that's the BBC's trump card. No government will ever really want to be without that fallback position of a state broadcaster.